Before we do anything, I would like to introduce Tomas Luta from the Northern Mariana Islands. He's a member of the Chamorro people who will be doing our land acknowledgement. He's also a third-year student at Berkeley.
Hi everyone, welcome to this space. The acknowledgement I'm about to deliver was developed by UC Berkeley's Native American Student Development Office. It reads, "We are gathered today on the occupied territory of the Ohlone people who have stewarded this land for generations. We recognize that Oakland sits on the territory of the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people, which was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. By offering this land acknowledgement, I affirm in this room the indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold the areas where we live more accountable to the needs of indigenous peoples." Thank you.
Thank you, Tomas. Now, Tawana Honeycomb is going to come up and do a poem and start us off.
I hail from a city where the water is off, 45 from Flintstones where they picking us off. They thought they had us cornered, but they pissed us off. Now we done come together, who would have thought? I witnessed her soul slither violently away from her body. Denial pursed tightly upon her lips. She fixed her face to tell me she wasn't thirsty, that her babies weren't 30 days away from being ripped from her custody. I could sense deception in her teardrops. She was lying to me about water, fibbing to keep her babies near. She almost let me leave them waterless. And I wanted to hug her, but I knew that her pride was the only ounce of protection she had left to muster, barely hanging on as if the Reaper had granted her another chance if she could just pull herself together. Why do folks gotta beg for water, hiding behind scarlet letters, spray painted to mark their negligence? I wondered what she thought of me, standing there with the fate of her family stuffed inside my trunk. I left 3 gallons of water and walked away. There'd be 10 more mothers for me to hydrate that day. I hail from a city where the water is off, 45 from Flintstones where they picking us off. They thought they had us cornered, but they pissed us off. Now we done come together. Who would have thought? How y'all doing today? I'm so used to like not grabbing a mic, and then the audience always yells at me like, "Get the mic!" So this is a little reminder behind me that I need to use the mic today. So I want to kick y'all off with like a brief exercise, okay? To get y'all juices flowing and thinking about what this topic is. Artificial intelligence, authentic belonging? Question mark, right? So I want you to think about some things, right? I want you to think about all the systems you interacted with when you came today. I want you to think about the things in your wallet, what you carry around in your wallet, right? If they collected your eye color, I want you to take that item out of your wallet. If they collected your eye color, in order for you to get the thing that you carry in your wallet, pull it out your wallet. If they collected your height or your age, pull that information out of your wallet. If they collected your health information, pull that information out of your wallet. If they ask you about your neighbors or references or family members, pull that information out of your wallet. If they ask for your social security number or your date of birth, pull that information out of your wallet. If they ask you about your income, how long you've been working, where you work, pull that out of your wallet. If they needed a way to reach you, your telephone number, your email address, pull that out of your wallet. And if you think any of those systems communicated with each other in order to make a decision about whether you could use that resource, your livelihood, whether you were able to access that system, put them together. Now I want you to turn to 3 or 4 people next to you and talk about what just came to your mind. I want you to think about the impact that that information has on you as an individual, has on the people whose information you shared in order to get it, has on your community and the decisions made for your community. And I just want you to take maybe 5 minutes and have a dialogue with the people next to you about what information was used, what decisions may have been made, what benefits you receive or what benefits they took away based on the information you individually carry on you and the information you gave up in order to access that information. 5 minutes.
The most effective way to protect attention.
60 seconds. All right. If you can hear my voice, be quiet. Hey, welcome back, y'all. All right. So, who is just jumping at the boots to tell me what you're thinking right now? Go ahead. Hey, let me run to you.
Testing. Okay. I thought, for lack of a better term, it was a very trippy exercise. Initially, when you said take out something that takes your eye color, I was like, oh, that's not me. My iPhone's not new enough. And then I thought about it, and I was like, oh my God, no, that's my driver's license. So that was really, really interesting to think about. And in our group, I think that was something we all shared, was that like, we were like, wait, oh, all of these cards. One person had only 1 gift card left in his wallet, so really interesting.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
One thing that we talked about a bit was kind of how much of a person's identity is now dependent on like government issued objects and, you know, something you could put into a spreadsheet. And something that, or someone brought up that like, you know, your identity is now less dependent on who you are as a person and more on the thing you have in your wallet. So it was, we kind of talked about the trajectory of that and seeing what is the point of no return where a person is now no longer who they are, like physically, but something intangible.
All right. Maybe 2 more?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Our group here turned out to be really connected to each other, and we didn't even know it. And we also chatted about the fact that these are these cards, as well as items like whether it's Apple Pay or whatever, maybe even on your phone, represent networks of validation amongst ourselves that may also leave people outside of an economy in which we're not necessarily connected. And it also doesn't allow for people who have a hard time within the parameters of having to fill out a form, right? And having to deliver certain things in a timely manner to be able to be part of that. And it's a very, in some ways simple, but also intellectual way of othering people from belonging in our economy, because that's really what these cards and phones represent, right? And the systems that we create around that.
Thank you. And one more, there was a final.
Hi, just related to what you just said, we were thinking about how there are things that you can't avoid, like to get on an airplane, right? We didn't have a choice. We had to use a passport or a driver's license. Right. But then there are other things that seem like they're not mandated by the government. There are these conventions and you're not exactly sure where they're coming from. Like we were talking about how a lot of places you cannot pay with cash. So if you wanted to protect yourself, which is related to what you were saying, if you want to protect yourself from the absorption of all this information, you can't do it. Now that's not the government telling the store, don't accept cash. That's the store's choice. So there are these other forces at play, and you do feel like you don't really have a lot of agency to navigate it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I know I left y'all in paranoia, but it gets a little better, okay? Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon. This is that weird time of the day, that continuum where it's sort of both. My name is Nanette Coleman, and I'll be facilitating this discussion today. I want to begin by extending a warm welcome to the many nonprofit, local government workers, artists, activists, private sector folk in the audience. I think that covers everyone, but I also heard there's some high school students here. Are there high school students in the back? Welcome. So a warm welcome to the many people doing the work in this audience. Welcome to the many justice, intersectionality, equity, diversity, and inclusion engaged audience members doing the work in this audience. These are not buzzwords, these are our world. It is with our shared commitment in mind and with our shared passion that I invite you to engage with us in one of my other passions. And I don't think I'm overstepping when I say it's also the passion of all our panelists. Unless you happen to be in the wrong room, you are here for artificial intelligence and authentic belonging. But our work and our discussion today will be so much broader and so much deeper than that. The description of our breakout session. As you know, artificial intelligence increasingly touches nearly every aspect of the public, private, and personal systems of our lives, from healthcare to policing to finance, from email to unlocking your phones. These technologies are bounds ahead of traditional regulatory mechanisms and frequently controlled and developed behind doors with little accountability to equity concerns and without many of us in the room. A few of my own framing thoughts before we get to our topic. So there's this term or idea in computing. It's called garbage in, garbage out. It suggests that if you put in biased information, fake information, or any flat-out wrong information, the outcome is faulty. Although artificial intelligence makes it possible for machines to learn from experience, with computers adjusting to new inputs and performing human-like tasks so that computers can do things like play chess, perhaps as well as a grandmaster, or a car can be self-propelled, maneuvering like with the skill of a New York City cab driver. I'm from New York, I have to say that. There's one thing, that's one thing, right? But then when you relied heavily on deep learning and natural language processing, the data entered matters. Again, garbage in, garbage out. If you put in racism, if you put in sexism, if you put in homophobia, that is what comes out. And social profiling resulting from it can be profound. A computer cannot do the work, as we talk about in this space. A recent talk I attended by Professor Safia Noble on her book, Algorithms of Oppression, comes to mind also. She offered numerous examples to draw on that countered the idea that inequality in our system is somehow washed clean in our data, in algorithms. And algorithms and AI are not a panacea. Run a simple search for the term black girls, and run that same search for white girls. If you do that in one sitting, it is sadly apparent what I am saying. Black womanhood is represented through sassiness, anger, and hyper-sexualization. We are not operating in what she calls an equal playing field for all forms of ideas, identities, and activities. Data discrimination is real. Let's quickly review our goals, the schedule, and I will introduce our panelists so we can get started. Participants will walk away from this session with a set of new questions with which to approach AI in a framework for how belonging can better embed in AI's future. And our schedule, because I hate it when speakers are up here talking and you have no idea when they're going to begin, middle, or end. So we had a poem and we had an exercise from one of our speakers. From there we'll go into my framing. Then 5 to 7 minute presentations in this order. Tawana will go first. Then Zoe and Mahmud, and then Renee, and then we'll finish with Sonya. I think I said that right. Tawana, Zoe Mahmud, Renee, Sonya. After that, our different panelists will share some of their reflections on the presentations they have just heard, so they'll get to reflect on each other's, and we'll open it up to questions at that point. After we go a little while, I'll pause, and we'll spend a little time with Tawana, who will introduce you to a few different resources that could help you in your strives to both be more data privacy literate, better understanding of AI, privacy, et cetera, and all those things, and also continue to do the work. And then we'll finish with an extended Q&A session. So let's briefly do introductions. So I want to begin by saying our panel approaches this work from diverse angles and at different stages with their work, but are all fully engaged in the ever-moving, evolving discussion about data and its far-reaching effects. I expect this is going to be both a robust and lively discussion just based on the comments I've heard from the audience in the last few minutes. So let's start with our speakers. So I'll begin with Renee DiResta, who is all the way over on my right. Renee is a Mozilla Fellow in Media, Misinformation, and Trust, and the Director of Research at cybersecurity company New Knowledge. She investigates the spread of disinformation and malign narratives across social networks and has advised the Congress, the State Department, and senior executives on the topic. She recently led one of the 2 teams that conducted research into Russian interference in the 2016 election on behalf of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. On her left is Zoe Kahn. Zoe Kahn is a PhD student at the UC Berkeley School of Information, where she collaborates with data scientists, computer scientists, and designers to understand how technologies impact people and society, with a particular interest in AI and ethics. Zoe asks questions of people and data that surface rich and actionable insights. Zoe is a qualitative researcher. Zoe brings an interdisciplinary background to her work that blends sociology, technology, law, and policy. Zoe. On her left is Mahmoud Hamsho, a Master of Information Management and Systems student at UC Berkeley, focusing in on data science. His research interests include machine learning, ethics, and cybersecurity. Mahmoud has worked as a data scientist intern for Internet of Technology security startup building deep models for predictive maintenance. Currently a researcher for the California statewide database, he is developing automated workflows to perform data quality checks and designing tools to lower the barrier to participating in California redistricting. So Mahmoud and Zoe are part of actually a 5-person team, so I also want to make sure we pause and recognize the members of their team that are not presenting. So that's Michelle Chen. Raise your hand, Michelle. Accept the love. Yuval Barash. And Amy Turner, all also from UC Berkeley. Then on Mahmoud's left is Sonia Katyal. I didn't get a chance to ask, is it Katyal? Yes. Is the Chancellor's Professor of Law at UC Berkeley and the co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. Professor Katyal is the Distinguished Chair of the Haas Institute's LGBTQ Citizenship Research Cluster. Her scholarly work focuses on the intersection of technology, intellectual property, and civil rights, including anti-discrimination, privacy, and freedom of speech. Her current projects focus on the intersection between internet access and civil rights, with a special emphasis on the right to information. Also algorithmic transparency and discrimination, source code and the impact of trade secrecy, and a variety of projects on the intersection between gender and the commons. She also deserves an extra round of applause because she got stuck in an elevator before she got here. So she got here, like, award. Okay. And then our final speaker on her left, Tawana Honeycomb Petty, is a mother, social justice organizer, youth advocate, poet, and author. Honeycomb is a 4-time author and co-founder of Riverwise Magazine, the director of data justice programming for the Detroit Community Technology Project, a member of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, a Detroit Equity Action Lab fellow, and a board member of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center for Nurture Community Leadership. Honeycomb recently co-authored another book with her Our Data Bodies Project comrades, the Digital Defense Playbook, Community Power Tools for Reclaiming Data, which she will tell you about a little bit later, following 3 years of building upon community gatherings, workshops, and one-on-one interviews across 3 cities. And then finally, my name is Nanette Coleman. I am a PhD candidate in the sociology department at UC Berkeley. My work sits at the intersection of the sociology of culture and organizations and focuses on cybersecurity, surveillance, and privacy in the US context. My research examines how organizations assess risk, make decisions, and respond to data breaches and organizational compliance with state, federal, and international privacy laws. I also study data privacy literacy and whistleblowers. The lenses through which I see my work include my prior studies in public administration, economics, and communication. For me, my entree to this topic is privacy, which I consider to be one of the central issues of importance of our time. Let's get to work, shall we? Our first speaker is Tawana.
Right. Y'all not tired of me yet? Okay, so as Nanette mentioned, I am the Director of Data Justice Programming for Detroit Community Technology Project. Be sure to @ us, my personal page. Y'all probably already seen all my tweets during this conference, but and that's our website where you can get a lot of information. So my work is primarily on data and digital justice. As Nanette mentioned, I co-led a 3-city participatory research project called our Data Bodies Project. And our Data Bodies Project, we've done over 137 interviews across 3 cities. And our prime 3 questions were, how do marginalized adults experience and make sense of the collection, storage, sharing, and analysis of their personal information? How, if at all, do marginalized adults connect their ability to meet their basic material and social needs to their inclusion or exclusion of database systems? And what strategies do marginalized adults deploy, if any, to protect their digital privacy, self-determination, and data rights? And I'll make sure we send out this slide. So my team, in collaboration with our 3-city participatory research project, as you can see, Detroit Community Technology Project, Center for Community Transitions, Inc., Los Angeles Community Action Network, and Stop LAPD Spying. And I will say that in LA, Stop LAPD Spying just had a recent win where they were able to don't let me say this wrong because I literally just read it on Twitter before here, but essentially, the criminalizing based on predictive policing and data has been squashed based on their work. So that's pretty tremendous. Please look it up. I literally read it 30 minutes before our session. So shout out to my comrades and Stop LAPD Spying. So what I always try to do is bring voices of the community in this space. The poem that I did was in reference to mothers struggling for water in Detroit and Flint. And these are voices from communities across 3 cities. And so I'll just read just 3, one from each city. Each institution should deal only with the information it needs. Collection systems should only capture data that's necessary. They should not intimidate people. They should not violate their human rights. These are community members in marginalized communities across 3 cities who may not understand the lingo or technology references and those things, but they know how they experience and interact and feel when these systems interact with them. That was from LA. For their benefit, they do communicate, but for my benefit, no. That's Charlotte. And I will tell you that these are pseudonyms, these are not their real names. So in our, we practice responsible data collection. My cell phone is a prepaid cell phone. I don't have a contract. So there is no true tie back to my identity. Wherever I can minimize my giving someone any of my information, I will. I avoid as many contracts as possible. I do a lot of direct channel transactions if I can, and I don't think there's anything that you can really do to secure yourself. Renita in Detroit. So what we discovered was patterns across 3 cities. Most folks felt insecure in that they were targeted. They felt resignation and resistance when interacting with systems. They felt separation from their families. In LA, we focus on unhoused populations. In Charlotte, returning citizens. And in Detroit, folks who are struggling with water crisis, housing insecurity, and those things. And they felt like they had, as one of you mentioned earlier, that it was a trade-off, that they had to trade off their identity in order to access resources. And if their identity wasn't quote-unquote squeaky clean, they didn't get the resources at all. We also discovered that when cities focus on security without a human element, that they are unsafe. That there is a conflation that happens between safety and security that is harmful, and that we have to draw a distinction. That security is militarization, surveillance, and technologies, and safety is community members knowing who their neighbors are, having a public school system that's effective, having resources in your neighborhood. Safety, community, security, surveillance. This is an example, another Detroiter. I mean, your face is not even your own anymore. Your face is being captured by cameras. This is how this Detroiter is experiencing surveillance technologies. This is a current project happening in Detroit called Project Greenlight, where they are putting green lights and cameras on, trying to force all commercial businesses to have green lights and surveillance cameras. So far, they've put up over 500 of those, and they've made a partnership. This is a public-private partnership with the police department and city government, and it's a crime data center that watches it 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They even have apps on their phone. They can watch your locations from home. So, to wrap up, more Detroit Community Technology Project collaborations. As Nanette mentioned, I'm part of Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, and we're currently organizing around Census 2020, not telling folks what to do or whether they should respond to the census, but providing political education so that people can make critical, informed decisions around their information, because we practice consent. Recommendations for equitable open data. We made recommendations for equitable open data to city government because there are over 2,600 open data portals across the United States, and each of you have one in your city. Most residents don't know they exist, so even whether you have access to the internet, the system has access to you. Project Greenlight, we're doing research in a collaboration to try to put a halt on that. Equitable Internet Initiative, we are making sure that community members in neighborhoods that don't have access to broadband, in Detroit, that is over 38%. If you're in an impoverished neighborhood, it's 60%. Don't have access to broadband internet, and so we have digital stewards who make sure that community members have access. And then also, through my research, we released the Digital Defense Playbook. So, you can learn more about our work here. These are our sites. There's a resource page. I'll talk more about it later. Thank you.
Next up is Zoe and Mahmoud.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, great. So we wanted to talk to you today about a project that we have been working on with with a local county that's using technology to connect people experiencing homelessness with housing. And the county brought us on in a consulting capacity to understand how the processes that take place, to understand the processes that take place at a system level, and then to provide technology recommendations to help standardize the process and make it more efficient. And when we entered the project, in addition to thinking about efficiency, we were really concerned about other values, things like human dignity and justice and autonomy. And so just to give you a bit of perspective, so the county that we're working with has over 5,000 people experiencing homelessness each night. And unfortunately, there's just not that many shelter beds or supportive housing units. And so it leaves the county with some pretty tough questions, like who gets access to these housing resources? How are those resources managed? What does it mean for them to be fairly managed? And so as part of a more broad national push, the county that we're working with recently began to implement a standardized process called coordinated entry. And as part of coordinated entry, this involves maintaining an ongoing database that contains pretty personal information about people experiencing homelessness, along with a history of all of the programs that they have used as part of this system. And while this general framework exists at the county level, because it's a fairly new process, there have been some growing pains in the system. And one of these is that it's led to each city in the county having really different tools and processes. So quite literally, this means that one city in the county uses an entirely different spreadsheet than another city. And so for us, as thinking about this project, we felt that before we could provide any sort of technology recommendation, the first piece was to really understand what the system is. And so we've currently been conducting interviews with a range of people, including county and city employees and shelter staff. And during those interviews, we really became aware of the important social and political contexts that are existing alongside of the technology. And so I want to tell you a brief story that Michelle, one of our team members who's in the audience, told me earlier this week from an interview that she had. So shelters oftentimes will have curfews, and this may not be all that surprising to us, the idea that you would need to be in by a particular time each night. But what might be surprising is to learn that parents sometimes are not able to make this curfew because they might be picking up their children from school. So if the school is across town or they're picking up their children from an after-school program, they're not able to make it back in time by the 6 p.m. curfew. And what this means is that they might get kicked out of the shelter. But what's even potentially more damaging with these data systems and tracking is that becomes part of their permanent record and linked to their client record. So as they continue to try and go look for housing, that becomes part of their record. And so there are many ways we could think about changing this. So one could be through policy, but perhaps a change could exist within the technical system. So for instance, we could design a technical system that allows the shelter manager to enter a note that says what the reason for this. Or we could even think more creatively about ways to actually acknowledge that parent for doing something really responsible, which is going and picking their child up from school and bringing them back. So I think that this is just one example of the difference between the lived experience of homeless people and then the technical system. And in our work with the county, what we really hope to do is to surface many more of these differences and to help them develop possible ways forward through technology or policy and work with them on those solutions.
So, as Zoe had mentioned, this is a great example. The curfew example is great because it shows how the technology doesn't account for the nuances of how complex humans are. And now I want to shift towards working on the policies and practices within organizations that are not explicitly written down. This is somewhat like unspoken rules. An example of these policies and practices we've discovered is that in some cities, there are set times for when shelter bed availability data should be updated on the spreadsheet by shelter employees. Typically, these set times occur during some of the busiest days for shelter employees. What could go wrong? Well, if the bed is not made available, then the bed is not matched to a new person. What this means is that somebody has to spend one more extra day outside, and the bed has the potential to stay unoccupied. This is exactly the reason why our team is working on mapping out the system and to make sure that tacit knowledge becomes more tangible. And once we make tacit knowledge more tangible, we hope to work with our partner organizations to integrate these practices and policies into their already existing solutions. I want to end off this talk discussing how it's possible that our group could even work on a project of this scale and scope, and with a project that could have an impact on the lives of so many people. We do not take this work lightly. We're able to do this research in part because of our team's interdisciplinary backgrounds. We're a team of graduate students with backgrounds spanning design, user research, data science, and social science. We are fortunate to have partnered with student as well as faculty-led groups that have extensive experience working with local governments and nonprofits to provide guidance and understanding on how automated technological solutions can impact society. Having mentorships on projects dealing with vulnerable populations is crucial. There are many ways to cause harm in doing research if not right. We need to work alongside these vulnerable populations to make sure that the policies and practices are on their side, to make sure the technology is listening to them and benefiting them. If anyone has any feedback or advice, we would love to talk after this discussion. Thank you all for your time.
Next up, we have Renee.
Is there a, can I have another clicker? Thank you. Hi, everybody. All right, sorry, I've got my little notes here so that I can not be looking back and forth, but those are your team members, and here we go. Great. It's great to be here today. So I work on kind of quantitative analysis of how information moves online and what we can learn about the ways in which people communicate. And more specifically, what we can learn about the ways in which those conversations can be manipulated. So one of the things I'll kind of start with here, just as a premise, which we can debate later, is that our political conversations are happening on an infrastructure built for viral advertising. Since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to take that at face value, and I'm just going to give you 3 reasons how this has happened over the last 10 years. So the first is the mass consolidation of audiences onto about 5 platforms. So from decentralization to centralization on the internet. The second is that those platforms prioritize engagement above all else because that's how they monetize. And so what that means is that they learn about their users. You may have heard the phrase surveillance capitalism, but they're learning about their users with the intent to target them with ads, and they need to know as much information as possible about their users to keep them engaged on the platform, so to keep showing them engaging content. So we have mass consolidation of audiences, we have precision targeting, ads and otherwise, and then we have the third factor, which is gameable algorithms. So most of the time when I refer to that, I'm talking about curation. So trending, search, hierarchical ranking of information. This is a really challenging problem because ultimately there is so much information in the world today. There's a finite amount of time, and so their job, which helps them monetize, is to show you the thing that you are going to want to see. And that is why they aim to learn so much about you. The problem is that this is a dual-use technology, which means that while it's, whatever you think about capitalism and advertising and all of that, there's another side of this entirely, which is that bad actors are actively taking this ecosystem, co-opting it, and using it for influence operations. And it is not just one country, it is many countries that are doing this now. I personally focus on Russia and state actors, state-sponsored activity. State-sponsored activity increasingly includes Iran and Saudi Arabia. We're beginning to see interesting ways in which countries are targeting their own people. So my work tends to focus on things targeting America, just more from a defensive standpoint, counterterrorism, the like. But there are a lot of studies being done on how Duterte in the Philippines uses information architecture to target his own people, how China uses it to control the way that their people receive and see information, how Russia, long before targeting the US, targeted the Ukraine and their own citizens with propaganda about things like the downing of the Malaysia Airlines plane that they shot down, or the Russian annexation of Crimea. And one of my jobs is to look specifically at how this is done kind of in a mechanical, in the technical sense of the word. And the number one way that this is effective is that what they're really doing when they target America is they're really working on amplifying tribalism. So we hear it reported sometimes as sowing division, but what it is really doing is it is building tribes. And there's a little bit of a distinction there. Because sowing division means you're telling people how awful the other people are. Building tribes means that you're reinforcing in-group identity, and then you're using those groups and the trust that you build within those groups and networks, and then you are activating those groups in service to sowing division after the fact. So what we saw with Russia was we saw the formation of distinct groups. Sometimes they were race or identity related. Well, they were always identity related. Sometimes it was race related, sometimes it was religion, sometimes it was political. And so they created Facebook pages and Instagram accounts that were designed to appeal to particular groups. And the content that they put out, all of the memes, all of the information, was to reinforce in-group identity. So if it was a group targeting Black women, it would be about things like hair and culture and relationships and raising children. If it was targeting Texas secessionists, it would be talking about, actually more about like love of Texas and strong belonging in a state and, the independent origins of Texas. And then what they do with this is they interlink all of these pages so that once you are part of this malign community, what you're seeing is the way in which they link the pages so that once you're part of that media ecosystem, that is what you see. And as you engage with it, that's what Facebook and Instagram continue to show you. So they're able to piggyback on the social network infrastructure to deliver propaganda without having to constantly put out ads or without having to constantly reach out to individuals. The propaganda is put out with really nuanced inflections. So they talk a lot about Syria. When they're talking about Syria with the Black community, they're talking about stories of family separation and refugee status. When they're talking about Syria to the right-wing targeted groups, it's about xenophobia. It's about we don't want them here. And when they're talking about Syria to left-leaning groups, it's a very anti-war kind of, the traditional anti-war type of rhetoric that you would see related to Iraq or Afghanistan, the notion that this is just another American engagement overseas. So the propaganda is delivered in the format that's going to make it most receptive. They develop personal relationships by reaching out to activists, and then when they have these relationships, these communities, these tribes, then they activate them. And then you see things like, as Black women, we can't vote for Hillary Clinton. As Texas secessionists, we need to make sure to bring our guns to the polling place. This was a real thing, the Oath Keepers are gonna be there, we have to defend our right to vote. And so they take the group that they've really, it hasn't previously been so much about the other, so much as about reinforcing that identity. And once they have it, that's when they're able to turn it on. And this is an example of just the black targeted pages on Facebook. So the squares, I know it's really hard to see, I have this all up online, but this was mapping the connections. The squares were their Facebook pages, the parallelograms were their Instagram accounts, and keep in mind this is just the pages targeting the Black community, and then those cloud-shaped things in there are real Black media. And so what they're doing is they're working to infiltrate so that it's not only their own content that they're sharing, but they're sharing content that is likely to resonate with the community in hopes that the community will share their content back. And this is a similar data analysis done on Instagram where you see on the bottom, sorry you can't read it because it's so tiny I think, on the bottom is the black targeted pages. They really treated the Black community as a very separate thing. The kind of loose clouds on the left are the left-leaning stuff, and then up on the right you have the pages that were targeting the far right. And then the question I'll leave you with before our conversation is really how do we quantify impact? So these memes over here, I'm not going to tell you which 3 they are, but 3 of them came from the Internet Research Agency. It came from Russia, and the remainder did not. And it's really hard to tell what's real and what isn't. And this is a page, this is a real Black media page that during the Internet Research Agency operation was regularly and frequently sharing content from 3 or 4 different pages. And so the question becomes, how do we think about the impact this is having on communities? How do we think about what this means from an identity perspective? Because that content has a malign underpinning, right? It's from fake people masquerading as something, but it resonates. And so when we think about the idea of identity online, particularly in communities where we are arguing against eliminating anonymity, we are arguing against gathering more information to verify your identity, how do we think about what this means for our social conversations going forward? And I am out of time.
Great. Hi everyone.
And we will finish off with Sonia. And after Sonia, all of our panelists will offer a reflection on what they heard.
Great. Thanks so much, Nanette. It's great to be here, and this is such a wonderful conference, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here. So what I thought I would do is actually try to address some solutions to some of the themes that we've seen in this panel, and try to kind of chart out some different possibilities. And to me, one thing that these conversations reveal is the way in which we're sort of living in a world that I think both exposes the limitations of law, but I also think it also exposes some of its possibilities. And so what I want to talk about in the minutes that I have is some of the broader possibilities of law in terms of articulating kind of a fundamental rights framework that might address some of the harms that we see in AI. And also chart out some of the different ways in which law could offer us some slightly more narrower and more granular possibilities than a fundamental rights framework. But let's just start for a moment by just thinking about some of the broader sort of fundamental rights frameworks that we might think about here. So to me, the biggest way to address some of these conflicts is by framing these issues not just in terms of the impact of algorithmic decision-making or AI on ordinary citizens, but rather to kind of tease apart some of these issues and think instead in terms of the fundamental rights about who is actually getting surveyed, right, and who actually has interests in disclosure. And the reason for this, I think, as many scholars have written about, is that in the US, many of the rights that individuals enjoy, and particularly here I'm thinking about privacy, are actually contextualized within a market-based framework. And the reason that that's important is because this differs from the rights that are enjoyed by individuals in places like Europe, where both the trajectory and the expression of individual rights are actually articulated, privacy being one of them, within a fundamental rights framework. And why is that important? And so what would it mean to kind of think about employing some of those insights here? And so here, I think so many different trajectories of rights are being implicated by AI. You have rights of due process, you have rights of privacy, rights of data privacy, rights of equal treatment, rights of dignity. And the other thing is the way in which these rights are actually connected to the exercise of other rights, right? Like the right to make contracts, the right to take out credit, the right to apply for a job, the right to vote, the right to travel, the right to enjoy health insurance or to purchase items, etc. And so again, I think what we have to do is sort of explore who is actually being implicated here by AI and how can we kind of frame a series of pathways forward. And so here I just want to offer a couple of different trajectories and kind of types of personas here that I think are really sort of concretely being implicated in the world of AI. And the first, I think, is the rights of the consumer. We've heard about the rights of the voter. I think it's also really important to think about the rights of the consumer. Too often, I think we frame AI issues as a set of issues that affect everybody, or right, everybody who's an individual in society. But the reality is that many of these issues affect us as consumers. And so what that means is that there could be space in the law to address some of these issues through the lens of consumer law. And what this allows us to do is to turn to areas like the FTC, Fair Credit Reporting Acts, fair housing regulations, health data privacy regulations, and explore how algorithmic decision-making or AI can be made more transparent so that we actually see some of the effects on ordinary citizens. Or we might think about the Consumer Bill of Rights that was introduced some years ago in Congress. And the second trajectory that I want us to think about are the rights that belong to the citizen. And this allows us to think about things like FOIA, right? Freedom of Information Acts, due process protections, smart city initiatives that are kind of operating throughout the country, open data, open source initiatives in localized jurisdictions, all of which can actually help on the ground to address issues of automated decision making. And the third might be a set of rights of entitlements and protections that actually apply to individuals who are targeted by our criminal system, right? And so here we might think about constitutional law or criminal procedure laws as a way of potentially seeking out greater levels of protection. So we might think here about Sixth Amendment protections and how Sixth Amendment protections might play out in cases where automated decision-making or forensic science is being used to target particular defendants. We might think about Fourth Amendment protections as an area that could be bulked up in this age of AI. Or we might think about some of the ways in which the blurring of the lines that we're now seeing between public prosecutors and private fact finders, right, vendors that are using forensic techniques, could actually be sort of more exposed if we think more aggressively about requiring forms of independent validation or more transparency around automated decision making. And all of these things, I think, can help to make the process more fair and transparent. And this brings me to kind of the last kind of persona that I think is actually the most interesting because it is the most unexpected. And so here, this involves the right of the investigator or the whistleblower, right? A significant source of promise when we think about artificial intelligence. Because what we are seeing in particular companies, right, even as they might face a lot of problems with respect to the way that the news and social media are treating companies like Google and Facebook, there are actually constellations of individuals that work within those places that are actually fighting for more transparency. So we're seeing more of this kind of resistance from within. And so here I think we also need to recognize that we've actually seen some of this before, that issues of information asymmetry and corporate wrongdoing have actually been addressed through things like Sarbanes-Oxley and compliance requirements. And so some of my own research talks about how recent federal laws on trade secrecy also include protections for whistleblowers. And so the final thing that I also want to talk about, which stems from this, is from this notion of the rights of the investigator. And this is kind of the broader notion of how federal and state agencies need to think about these issues as a crisis, but a little bit of a different kind of crisis than what we've seen so far. This is a crisis. It's not just a crisis of transparency, but I also think it's a crisis of a fiduciary duty, right? Who has this fiduciary duty to protect the citizen, the consumer, the criminal, the investigator, the innovator, right? The whistleblower. And so to the extent that we're relying on law to solve these problems, I also think it's really important to keep in mind that really framing it as a question of fiduciary duty, a question of the responsibilities that governments owe to their citizens, right, helps us to kind of think through some of these issues that come up with respect to algorithmic decision-making and AI. But I think that there is more room in private and public law, I think, than many people realize. So thanks so much, and I look forward to your comments and ideas.
To give you a chance to think about your questions, we are going to begin by hearing reflections from our panelists on what they've heard. So things that maybe they took away that are shift the way they think about their own work, or suggestions for each other. Who would like to go first? Renee? Okay, great, thank you.
The thing that I was thinking about as folks were talking was the tension. I'm trying to think of the way to phrase this. The interesting tensions between individual and society in some ways. Reminded me of conversations about things like counterterrorism versus civil liberties back after September 11th, and what that looks like not only in the physical world right now, but in the online space. How a lot of we're trying to use the frameworks that we have in a very new kind of place, right? We have never had a global public square. That has never existed. I think a lot about whether that should exist, and I increasingly think it actually shouldn't. But the ways in which we wanted, a lot of my work is around election integrity. How do you have election integrity when you can't do it without cooperation between government tech platforms and researchers? You just can't. So the question becomes, like, what do we share? How do we think about combating the kind of stuff that I see online every day with the very real individual, risks to the individual of data extraction. So that was what I was thinking about.
Thank you, Renee. Anyone else? Sonia?
Yeah, so as Renee was talking, and as Zoe and Mahmoud were talking, and also Tawana, one thing that just really struck me was that we can think of this crisis as a crisis that is created by AI, but one of the effects of this crisis is an increasing distrust of everything that we see around us, right? Because we can no longer trust the electoral system to do the right thing. We can no longer trust that our votes mean the things that they mean. We can no longer trust that when we seek out social services, that social services will, take into account the responsibilities that we owe to our families. And the collective effect of that, I think, is something that it's so hard to estimate, right? In terms of the effects of that on our institutions. And that, to me, is, I think, the real sort of cultural crisis that gets created in a world of AI. I don't know how many of you have seen the film Gattaca, but if you haven't, it's such a brilliant sort of demonstration of the world that we are increasingly moving towards.
Tawana?
Oh. I always feel so heavy in these discussions. I think the thing that I'm thinking about listening to everyone is how the responsibility from people who interact with these systems is kind of like a lot of times removed from the equation, and we kind of talk about systems as like systems that don't exist that exist outside of folks who have inherent biases and different things. And so I'm thinking about how we function in autopilot as well, and I'm thinking about like that's kind of like the analog version of AI is like how you just function based on like how your culture or how you've been conditioned, or I'm thinking about coming from a city like Detroit and how most of the world just has an opinion about the city, like the whole world, literally everywhere I've been, every country. And I'm thinking about how those folks now control these systems, or how we've all contributed with what we type, what we say, how we function, how, and interact with these systems, and how now AI has taken on that life. So I'm just thinking about like the work we have to do as individuals to be more responsible stewards. Yeah.
Mahmoud?
Kind of piggybacking off of what Tawana said, I just think it's like so important for organizations such as yourself, these advocacy organizations, to really work on the behalf of people, because there's just pretty much like these machines and systems, AI, and a lot of the technologies we are using every day. And it's naive of us to assume that everybody's technologically literate and knows what kind of data is being collected for them. So it's so important for there to be like these advocacy groups that's trying to shed light and provide people with this type of information on what information is being extracted from them, how this information is being used. So thank you so much for doing that type of work. And then kind of on the topic of like law, so we really recently seen how like the Google AI ethics board kind of got shut down. With me, it always comes to my mind is like, how do we get government to kind of catch up with these types of regulations and kind of not give these private or public companies the power to create their own regulations? It seems that it's something that we as a society need to kind of collaborate together and work together to think about the policies and practices that these private and public institutions need to work around.
Zoe?
Yeah, I think just piggybacking again off of Tawana and Mahmoud, I've been thinking a bit lately about sort of this idea of like technocratic governance with these platforms, and the idea that, and touching a little bit on what Renee was talking about in terms of when you're trying to validate what is real information or what's not information, the platform is likely going to be making a decision about what types of information they think they should be able to collect. And that's a decision that's being left up to experts. And so I recently read an article that was about, I think it was dispersing funds for disability, and it was a professor at the University of Michigan who said, you just have to trust us that we made the right, that we're smart, we know what we're doing, just trust us. And as it resulted, the system cut off a huge amount of funds to a lot of people who were really struggling. And so I think trying to think creatively about how we can get around this idea of just trust us, or how we can think about bringing people in creative ways, particularly as it's a topic that I think feels kind of exclusionary because you feel like there's a lot of technical knowledge that you need, or to have these words to be able to be part of these conversations. And so I think this kind of work is just really important.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up to questions now. Actually, we have one more thing to do before we open it up to questions. Tawana is going to introduce us to a few resources. So why don't you go ahead and take the mic while I get the...
I'll be super quick because I want to hear from y'all. So I'm just a fan. I'm like a technologist, work in technology, but access is super important. So everything that we create in a document or zine or magazine or literature and make it downloadable for free as well as sell it so we can have money. But so if you go to DetroitCommunityTech.org, you can download our Rebuilding Technology 1 and 2 zines, our Opening Data 1 and 2 zines that actually walk you through the Open Data Portal. Everyone has an open data portal. These are rooted in Detroit, but you could use them and adjust them to your own particular cities. We also have the Digital Defense Playbook, which is downloadable as a free PDF. If you have the resources, make a donation. If not, download the PDF. We rather you use the workshops and things in this information and become responsible stewards of information and technology. In addition to that, we have Rebuilding Community Tech, Teaching Community Tech, I apologize, has workshops, teaches you how to teach, teaches you how to train, teaches you how to talk through using digital justice principles, equitable internet initiative principles, how to function with technology in a valued, principled way. And there's also the People's Guide to AI and thinking about community-centered ways of interacting with these systems. So Detroit Community Tech, Knowledge.org, allymedia.org. And all of this information is available to be downloaded for free and shared out. And you can also purchase the physical copies to be mailed out to you.
And I know you all want to take pictures of that slide, so totally fine to take out your phone if you want to take a picture of the slide if you haven't done that yet. So our panelists are coming from really different places with relationship to data. Tawana, grassroots. Sonya, law and legal. How does data transform our civil rights? Zoe and Mahmud, local project about actual implementation in systems and structures. And Renee is interested in authenticity within data. So think deep fakes and the alleged Russian election meddling, right? Alleged. Make no mistake, today is about approaching our data-driven world from different places, thinking beyond one conception and thinking around it. With that said, today is about being together in this interactive breakout session for 90 minutes in community with each other. So everyone in this room is an expert on this, and we look forward to hearing your voice. So if you have a question, please, we want to hear you. So I'm about to walk around with the microphone. We're going to take 3 questions at a time and then give our panelists a chance to respond. So I will pass this microphone, and I will take this one. Yep, take that. So do we have questions? So we'll take 3, so we'll start over here. And just as a reminder, questions end with a question mark.
Helpful reminder. Hi, everyone. So I have a question specifically about this thing that was mentioned towards the end about the tension. In one instance, you mentioned it as counterterrorism and civil liberties. But the thing that I thought about when you brought up those memes was the recent news pieces on how folks in the Black Lives Matter movement are being targeted as quote-unquote black identity extremists. And sort of, I guess I want to hear the panel's thoughts, especially the person who's from Detroit, because Tawana? Okay. Because, yeah, like just that tension, like how do you deal with that fact that, like our ability to be critical about the United States as Muslim women specifically, as black women specifically, is so much more like surveilled and then taken on to mean like, oh, you are going to blow up a building next, right? Whereas like, you know, Texas separationists, like they're just, oh, you know, these like old white men, they're just thinking about things. You know, like, so that difference and that tension is one question. And then I have a second question real quick, which is that like, this is mentioned, what you were saying next to me, we were talking about like technology as a means of healing versus breaking. And I just wonder, like all of these tech fixes, like, oh, let's put in a note or let's figure out how to make like, where does it fall short? Like, where does the answer stop being, how do we make the algorithm function better? And where does it start being that, like, actually we shouldn't use technology to manage this relationship?
Okay, let's get 2 more. We want to get as many questions out as possible. So right here.
My name is Halima Brucha. I work at the Green Lining Institute on tech equity policy with a focus on race and gender. My team is currently working on how we can learn to use data and technology for good things, and also addressing the ways that algorithms are making people of color poor. Shameless plug, my team has a workshop on that in case anyone's interested, and we're really trying to make this accessible to nonprofit advocates across sectors, because this is impacting access to healthcare, access to insurance, education, transportation, literally every single sector possible. So thinking about like how do we actually embed equity, racial equity, gender equity within codes, is that possible? And you know, I don't know if any of you saw the article by Vox that was talking about how dark-skinned people are more likely to be hit by self-driving cars. How do you correct for those kind of things, right? Google's gorilla image mistake still has not been corrected. They just took out the tag for gorilla and for black people. So where are the solutions for that are actually tangible? And then my second question is, how do you make this an issue that people can advocate for on the grassroots level? Because tech equity isn't a bread and butter issue. People don't see it as something that's impacting their access to housing or food. And so how do we make sure that people in the community understand this and are able to address this? And then lastly, like quick shameless plug, I'm so sorry, but I'm doing a panel on white supremacy and racism in tech at University of Washington. Talk to me if you're interested.
Okay, so that's 4 questions from 2 people. Does anyone have 1 question? One? I see my UC Berkeley peeps back here. I'm going to come to the back for 1 question.
My question is, if I, as an individual, operate under the foundation that technology is part of the systems of which I exist in, and I cannot not use emails anymore, and that this is the foundational base of how I operate as a human, then how do I be a responsible steward when it feels like I'm just contributing to the system that I exist in?
Okay, panel, we have 5 questions on the table. Would somebody like to start us off?
Yeah. So I will just say on the topic of I feel like the questions were pretty synthesized, honestly. We're looking at systems of white supremacy, black folks being targeted. How do we use technology as responsible stewards, and how do we embed equity into algorithms? I'm going to go back to the human-centered aspect of how we function, and the principles that I identify. Not saying that we are we have all the answers, but in Detroit, we did take the time to get together with community members and develop principles, Detroit Digital Justice Principles, Equitable Internet Initiative Principles, and those are not just principles for online, but those are principles for offline and how you engage with one another as a community. If we are not centered on values and we don't treat each other as human offline, we're not going to do it online. The other thing I want to say is that technology keeps being used as like it's just the internet, right? Technology is a pen. Technology is how you use your voice. If you are harmful when you write, you will be harmful when you use the computer. So there is levels to technology. So we're not trying to tell people don't get on the internet, don't use the internet. What we're trying to say is when you get on there, behave a certain way, right? And it's a lot more of us than it is of those who are creating harm. And we have to realize our power to change the algorithms by the way we interact with one another online. And I don't think we take enough consideration into the power of us to navigate those systems. Now, I'm not saying that overnight we're going to transform somebody who's sitting up in a bubble somewhere making evil decisions, but it is really, really important for us to change the culture of how we interact with these systems. As a Detroiter, as you identify, I come from a city where, like I said, the whole entire world had one particular opinion about where I come from until like 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, so every time I hear Detroit is coming back, I hear Make America Great Again, the exact same feeling. And so I would just say, like, there's some internal work that has to happen, and how we're dealing with anti-Black racism globally, because the way that we interact, the tunnel that we create online, those all have impacts on the systems and how they engage with us. And so I'm just saying we have to realize and recognize the power that we have within this room to transform how we interact online, and technology is not just the internet.
You want to add to?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to make kind of 3 quick points in response to some of the questions that were asked. So I guess one of the first themes was about whether or not it is actually possible to sort of improve the outcome of AI. So I would submit that the question about whether to use or to not use these tools is a question that I think it's actually a little, I think we have to ask that question in every context, but I have to admit that I'm a little bit pessimistic about rolling back some of the ways in which AI tools are being used. And part of that is because I just think that private companies and consumers recognize that there's a lot of value that comes from targeted advertising. And I'm not saying that there is, I'm just saying that I think that the market is moving in a certain direction. And as long as the market moves in a certain direction, I think that there are going to be more and more companies that are going to harness or seek to use these tools. So us as consumers have to be very vocal about the ways in which we want to resist the use of AI in these contexts. And so it's really important when we see news reports about ways in which AI has gone wrong for those of us to speak out. The other thing that I think is really important to also point out is that we're doing this in the United States within a framework that, as I mentioned before, doesn't have a fundamental rights framework when it comes to data privacy. But we only need to look to Europe to see how a lot of these questions are being dealt with very differently. So in the EU, you actually have a right to an explanation when you are governed by an automated decision. You actually have stronger data privacy rights. And so GDPR, which is the regulation that took effect a year ago, has totally revolutionized the set of expectations that European citizens face in a way that is a stark contrast to what we're seeing in the US. Now, here's the good news. A lot of localities, including California, recognize the value of data privacy principles. And so it is possible to move in the absence of the federal government taking into account the consumer's Bill of Rights. It is actually possible to move in localities. And that does mean it falls on all of us, just as Tawana said, in this room to demand that those changes happen. And that's, I guess there were 3 points in there somewhere, but.
I'll address specifically the, can we make the algorithm function better, or do we use it at all? Because this is something that I've spent about 2 years now thinking about. So when we first began to realize what had happened with the election of 2016, I have to say, one of the first things I thought was, the silver lining to this election is we're going to have a conversation about what's been happening on the internet for 4 years now that we previously had avoided, right? And I know that might not be a popular opinion here, but that was one of the things that I thought about a lot. And the question became, the internet as it is today is if you can, the power to influence opinions lies with the ability to widely disseminate a message. And the internet is a massive tool for influence. And foreign governments have realized it, our government knows it, political parties know it, activists know it. And so the question becomes, how do we think about what we want our channels of influence to look like, particularly since they are algorithmically mediated? And those of us who looked at the Russia thing, we went to Washington and sat there and lobbied congressmen to hold the tech hearings. That was how that got done. It was a group of folks, myself included, who went down there repeatedly in 2017 saying, you have to hold hearings. You have to hold hearings because people don't understand what's happened. You have to hold hearings because half the country doesn't believe that it's happened. When I kind of cracked up over the use of allegedly, because we were like, God, it did, how long are we gonna have to sit there and say, like, regardless of collusion, this other thing happened? And so I would say, I recognize that activism has a cost, and believe me, I know it after the last couple of years of of experiences trying to get this, get it, have some outcomes emerge here. But every couple weeks at this point, the platforms are rolling out new protections. It happened a couple hours ago. Facebook just acknowledged that they're going to start looking at things like link sharing off of Facebook versus link sharing on Facebook. So the idea of PageRank and basically incorporating some of how PageRank operates on Google, thinking about search results and quality domains, they're going to start looking at on Facebook. They're also going to start looking at domains that spread phenomenal amounts of misinformation and doing what we've been calling do not recommend, which is basically yanking those groups out of the recommendation engine, in part because that's how a lot of the conspiratorial stuff spreads, right? I know that when I pull up Twitter, I'm going to see a litany of comments basically saying that those of us who have advocated for that are advocating for tech company censorship, right? Are advocating for tech companies to decide what we see. And to that I say they already decide what we see. So it's the voices of people who are actively engaging on this stuff. You really do have to be so incredibly vocal, and I know that that's time consuming, and I know that that's a pain in the ass, but that's really all there is at this point. Or you check out and you stop using them.
Shall we take 3 more questions, or would you like to respond? Would you all like to respond?
I just kind of want to respond to her question regarding using these technologies at a local level. And first thing I want to say is that a lot of these employees or staff that want to use these technologies to improve services, they have great intentions. The reason they're introducing these technologies is to improve efficiency, to help out more people. That may not be the fact all the time. The technology may not be able to fill in all the gaps. And this is why it's important, and something we're advocating for is kind of using a user research approach to developing these technologies, to really meet with advocacy groups, meet with the people that the data is being collected from, figure out what they're comfortable with, let them know how their information is being used. And only then can we potentially improve the technology, because as kind of Sonia said, we don't have any way to say that you shouldn't use the technology, because it does have its pros and cons. But for what we're doing right now is that we're really just pushing to make everybody's voice heard in the process, all the stakeholders' voice heard, to make sure that the limitations are laid out on the table and that everybody's made aware of them.
And yeah, I think just to piggyback off of that, so we started this project only a couple of months ago. So we're just in this phase where we're learning a lot right now. And I think one of the things that we're really keyed into, and as we try and understand the process, is to understand what are the human processes that are taking place that are critical, that are human. And so we were interviewing someone, and they told us that they believe that a house needs to be like an ecosystem, and so you need lots of different types of people in there. And so if you have somebody who's maybe unhoused but is going to college, and you have somebody who sees that person in the house and gets super inspired and wants to go to college, it's this whole ecosystem, and they're kind of thinking about that ecosystem. And how do you allow for flexibility so that somebody can develop that within the system? And if you just think about somebody as a number, then all of a sudden you may be not able to allow for that sort of human touch that might be really important. And so I think part of what we're trying to think about in this process is how do we document where the human is really important and where we may not want to have an automated system.
Can we take maybe 2 more questions? We've about 6 minutes left, so 1 question each, please.
This will be 1 question. So I don't dye my hair this color, it's actually gray. So I can tell you that I was around when civil rights legislation was being debated. I was old enough to understand the thing, but not old enough to understand the legislation. I was in a different point when the internet bandwidth got auctioned off. I was very much understanding what the implication of that is. So my question is, here we are, we're talking about a lot of points with a lot of high school students in the back. And the kinds of decisions we're making today are going to affect their lives much more than it's going to affect ours. So the question is, how do we engage youth in the decisions that are going to affect their lives until they have kids?
1 more question. Oh.
Right, closer.
Hi. I'm a journalist actually working on a piece about AI, so if any of you are available afterwards, I would love to talk to you. I guess my question is kind of a pushback. So, you were talking about how there's more protections in Europe, but the protections around data privacy, right? And I thought this question that somebody asked about, well, what if we don't need AI, is actually something that's really important. And I think the example of Stop LAPD spying, pulling out predictive technologies from the policing department, is something that we really have to think about. And the reason I think about it a lot here, and this is, we're in Silicon Valley basically, and there's shit being produced that we don't want. No one wants self-driving cars. Nobody. We didn't make that decision. Corporations made that decision for us, and then we're going to have to deal with the aftermath of them killing people, mostly people of color. So my question is, data privacy is great, but how do we have a mass movement against artificial intelligence unless it's in ways that we decide we want it, right? Because this is a problem with technology and science in general, is that there are ways that community wants science used. We would love cheap medicine. We would love insulin, right? We would love EpiPens. We don't want the other crap that's coming out, and we have no say over it. So how do we organize and push back to see the kind of technology we want and to get rid of the technology we don't want?
We have 3 minutes, so I think we should go ahead. And I'm sure our speakers will hang around afterwards to talk to people.
I'll take 60 seconds and give that. I know I keep saying this, but like these corporations were making decisions about our lives before artificial intelligence. As an example, auto industry was deciding who dies in their office when it came to their equipment before they made the car a self-driving car. And so like it really is human-centered impact as an example. And I just think that that we have to resist. I know Renee said it before, like we've seen a tremendous impact of activism and social justice. And so one of my comrades would always say, you need to deputize yourself. If you see a good fight, get in it. And I think that every single person in the room has to get in the struggle to push back against these systems, every single person. So whether the car is driving by itself or you driving the car, no matter what, you have to get your conversation in this because it has an impact on everyone. And as far as the children go, we work with young people every day. They're on the front lines of this struggle. Not tomorrow, today they're on the front lines of this struggle. And they've been organizing nonstop. As a matter of fact, in Detroit, Next Gen Apps, one of our youth programs, they created a most polluted zip code in the country is in Detroit, in Southwest Detroit. And those kids created an app to monitor air quality, to push for policy in their neighborhood. And so you have people, young people engaged on the front lines of the battle, like right now. And we need to listen to them, just flat out. Yep, they got all the solutions.
Final comment.
Okay, well, I'm going to actually not make a final comment.
Renee,
that's not
final
fair.
comment.
No
No pressure.
I'm a mom. My kids are 5 and 2, and my son will occasionally just absolutely blow me away by my husband drives him to preschool every day, and he'll come in and he'll say, Mom, I was listening to a podcast and I'm just like, yeah, okay. We have arguments over YouTube. And he's 5, and my husband and I are both engineers, so it's just the way it is in our house. I grew up with technology. I grew up learning to code. My dad's an engineer too. I try to think about how do I design the world that I want him to live in. My activism is very much rooted in being a mother, actually. But also, I really do believe that there is, and maybe this is unpopular, but an opportunity to kind of not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I actually do want self-driving cars, and one of the, and I think that there are a lot of people who have accessibility challenges who would also say they want self-driving cars. So the idea that something is inherently bad because there are some aspects that are bad, I kind of reject that. I feel like a boring, moderate incrementalist a lot of the time when I have conversations with people. But I do think that if you get, better representation of voices in the room, better representation of voices within the companies that make the decisions, more ethical oversight, more oversight at all, candidly, for some of the companies that are building the products that shape the world, we can actually have, both, I hate the cliche of like having our cake and eating it too, but technologies that move us into the future, and that future is a more equitable and just future. Is that a good final comment?
Excellent point to end on. Please give a round of applause for our panel. Enjoy the rest of the conference.